An interesting thing I found about the use of phi with KEFs is, check this out. So this is phase, right? Like no matter what, it's playing the same note, but just you're hearing like the phase relationship, like the woo, wee, wee. But you hit it at any level, you get the same notes as the first and the fifth, which is what is called a power chord. Twinkle, twinkle, oh, say, can you see? This is not just that either. This one too. So everything applies to this one. Here's a woofer. Twinkle, twinkle, oh, say. And here's actually an open driver, which is what I use to replace this one. It actually has a different note. These notes are actually the same. Da 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 da. So dun 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 dun. So yeah, so these are actually both the unicues. This is actually free-floating, but the way they're doped with the titanium and the poly gives you the same effect. So, dun 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 dun. Same thing applies to this one. So this is a center speaker. What's neat is that this one's actually the first one to start using the flattened surround, where you can see how this little flattened area here is starting to disappear. Whereas on the next series, like when they rebooted with the 3000X and then to the LS50, they got rid of this flat rim and replaced it with the Z-Flex. But here you can see, since this is meant to be on axis and pointing straight at you, they just use something similar to the Z-Flex, where the cone continues to the surround, but it's the same relationship. Dun 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 dun. So they also do the same thing here. These are actually sealed from here to here, all the way down to the bottom. So that's the same relationship from here to here as it is from here to there, as it is from here to there. It's basically the same thing as your finger from the knuckle, like to the middle knuckle to the tip. So it's basically just like a ratio you find in nature that just happens to work, and it makes it sound more musical, essentially. So what happens is that even though these two are played in parallel electronically, this one always plays about, I think, 8 hertz lower and about 600 milliseconds behind this one. So it plays like as if it's behind that by like, you know, back here. So this speaker ends up sounding like it's deeper than it really is, which is pretty cool. And then these two play the 1/5 interval, which I also thought was really neat. So if you face this at a wall, these two couldn't create a standing wave because these two would fundamentally would emphasize the tonic and the fifth relationship. So just some interesting design tips, because when putting these speakers together, it was necessary to make it, because it's actually not a speaker they sell. It's actually a speaker that's custom made using the XQ drivers, whereas that's the IQ driver. That's why this one doesn't really fit properly, and you can kind of see like the hood protrude a little bit. There's actually a copper top, which was a little green patina in the front right there. But yeah, I thought I was, and there's that flat region I was talking about, and this is just a regular roll surround. So that flat region right there is about 2 inches, and then the flared region is there. If you look at this flat region right here and the flared region, essentially what they did was they just took that flat region and enlarged it. So now this is the flat region, and the entire flare is here. So the flare part and the tweeter part, whereas it used to be a 1/4 inch, the tweeter is now a full inch, and the flare is the entirety of the woofer up until the surround, and the surround now acts like the flat part of the original drivers. And that's how they basically rebooted themselves after they introduced the Tangerine waveguide, which is what they used to make it so that the tweeter dome would disperse as if it was a flat panel, and the relationship of the air between the dome and the little fins would ensure that you wouldn't have what's called the shotgun effect. In fact, you could actually put like a round disc, a coin or something, right in the front, and you'll notice that it doesn't affect the sound at all, because what you're actually hearing is the sound coming outward. Because not typically, if you were not to have this contraption here, the dome would piston in a way where there's a hot spot in the center, and the sides would graze the air, so you wouldn't get as much efficiency. So this causes equal efficiency across the entire dome, so that the dome could actually disperse itself widely enough where it's from the front, you're hearing the dome actually coming from here. Whereas if you were to listen to it directly, close enough where you could hear the tweeter and the woofer as two separate components, you're definitely too close. But what's cool is that it makes it so that it still works just by standing back a little bit. Then the two end up sounding converged as a single point, because it sounds like the tweeter is just effectively the size of the woofer, and the woofer and the tweeter are playing as if they both play one, as if they're one driver working in unison. And then when you shift to the side a little bit, you then hear the sound of the tweeter migrate to about here, and the woofer and the tweeter ends up coming from you at this angle. So either you're hearing it from the front, and the tweeter ends up coming from it as a sum of the whole entire reflection off the rim and the woofer converged, or from the side where it then bounces off of this parabola here and comes at you converged with the woofer and the tweeter hitting you from pretty much any angle, which is why KEF speakers are usually suggested to be played like placed wide, as far as like, tilted straight, as long as they're not, too close to a side wall. So yeah, So this is the first time they used that, which is why they reseated the surround so that the woofer actually goes over and ends up striking this right here. Kind of like the facade, the face to the XQ series or the Coda series, where the woofer, the tweeter, basically what happens is this whole entire portion right here plays to using this thing right here as its waveguide. So the tweeter uses this thing as its waveguide, and then two in unison use this as its waveguide, and then the whole entire thing in unison uses this as the waveguide, the whole entire baffle. So that gives it this really interesting open sound, like an open baffle sound. Meanwhile, the the port, which is back here, shoots diagonally downward at an angle, while the port mouth is at the top corner. So you get maximum compression because there's actually a seal in there, and the voice coil straddles itself right where this ring, that ring right there is actually where the voice coil is situated. So the tweeter has plenty of space to get as much air as it needs, and the little striations are actually fins behind it. So when this thing's pressurized, it actually allows the inside to work almost like a little mini cathedral, like Sydney Opera House or something. So when you listen to the inside of the port using like a stethoscope, it actually sounds like you're hearing like music as if it's being played in the back of the room. Almost like a mono speaker could sound out of phase. Or like you're in like, the smoking room or the chill out room at a club where you still hear the music, but you hear the bass and the rest of the music sounds kind of out of phase. So the music that comes out of the tweeter, since it comes out diagonally, it never bounces off the back wall in a way that actually causes any phase interruptions or anomalies with the forward firing driver. So they end up adding and playing off of each other, which is what gives this such a distinctly 3D sound compared to this. Unfortunately, they never added the gasket here, so there's actually a hole between the woofer and the tweeter island thing. So as you're playing louder, this thing doesn't pressurize the same way this thing does. This has a seal between the tweeter and the woofer. And they never actually added the seal until these things, they stopped making the LS50 driver and made the Metas instead. And now they have the seal. And so they finally made it so that it actually is capable of the I guess, sound vessel design, where it's the inside of the box is tight enough where the elliptical back of the port can actually load with enough pressure that it actually ends up playing music that sounds more musical to the human ear than the music would otherwise sound. So whereas these actually work better as monitors and work great as part of the best vocal monitors that they were made, because they were made to be a revisit to the LS35As. They have a natural built-in volume sweet spot where if you play them too loud, they will sound more raspy and congested, because as the internal box gets more pressurized, air begins to leak out of here. And as air begins to leak out here, the timing of this and this starts coming out of phase. So you end up getting congestion and shoutiness at the same time. Because whereas the tweeter needs to rely on the woofer, it has to play with the same sort of accuracy as like a minute and a second hand, or a minute and an hour hand. So you can see the tweeter as being like the second hand and the woofer as being like the minute hand. When you play this thing too loud and there's air shooting out of there, it no longer has the ability to actually play uninterrupted, which is what causes the sound to sound raspy, where people call it congested or they'll call it shouty, because the two are actually opposites. One is pretty much it being pretty much overloaded, and one is being basically underloaded. In terms of the tweeter is being made more efficient by the woofer, or made less efficient by the woofer when it's being used as a waveguide. So these right here are made square again. They designed it so that if you pay attention, it's actually meant to be a very easy to use speaker. That's the way that was designed. So you just plop it down and it just works that way. But if you look at the LS60s, which are supposed to be kind of like, I guess, the micro blades, you notice they aren't actually made proud like this. They're actually designed like this. There's actually a pretty much an R series type driver that they place inside the Metas. And when they made the new LS60s, which is pretty much like a tower version of these, I guess, or a tower version of the Metas, they didn't keep it proud like this. They actually made it so that the front is crescent shaped. So you look at the Metas, sorry, the LS60s from the side, they actually have the same crescent shape as this does. See how this has a crest, like it's not flat, but it's crescent shaped, which is why the grill is also crescent shaped, and why the blade, rather than just not going with like, you know, a round proud baffle like this, actually cut a hole, like an oblong hole, and basically put the same type of waveguide as on this thing. So some little neat trivia there. But check out the ratio here. See the ratio of the top and the bottom, like vertical versus horizontal? It's the same as, here, let me line it up from here to there, there, and there. Yeah, so they just like did a lot of work making sure that it would be what they call the total system design, which is where the whole entire thing works as a musical instrument, and it's not just like, you know, off-the-shelf drivers in a box. Every component is designed to work in unison. These, I suppose, the reason why they made it so that they can't use the entire front as a waveguide is because a lot of people are supposed to use these as mini monitors and place them sideways, and so it wouldn't really work as well. Because the reason why these are crescent shaped is that it causes more drag upward and downward and more efficiency laterally. So these things actually shoot more widely, giving you more of like a wide, like almost like a widescreen television. And it also helps prevent ceiling and floor boundary reflections. So you can play these things tilted straight and they'll actually sound fine versus having to aim them, you know, at you like with other speakers. And these things can be placed sideways and they end up being the same thing, because this shape right here is pretty much the same all the way through. But if you look at the LS60s, you notice that they don't actually have this proud convex shape. They have a contour that dips inward, just like this one does, just like the blade does. Just some weird, interesting information about like how, because I remember this one DIY stuff, which one was called. They were auditioning speakers to see which ones would be really good, a really good basis for designing your own speaker, and these ones ended up winning the blind listening test, and that was seen as, you know, unfortunate because you can't really make these, but people sure do try. Because what's funny is that after these got more popularity, as people were just rediscovering how good they were, people started pirating the tweeter on these things, even though you can't actually replace the tweeter on these things. So all across eBay, you actually find more tweeters of that you're supposed to actually, apparently they're anticipating people would buy and replace, but it's literally impossible to replace the tweeter on this thing. But they made them anyway, so I don't know. I guess sorry, you guys, or whoever decided to pirate 2000X tweeters, but those things serve no purpose and no one could ever use them. So that's why they're just sitting there on eBay, which I find kind of funny. The drivers to these, you need the serial numbers to get a replacement part, which is the same thing that KEF's always done to kind of keep their trade secrets. And I suspect that's why little details like this are not really as openly talked about until like years later. Like the way the back fins work, almost like a heatsink. There's these little fins in the back, and they work like horns in the sense where they're not parallel, but they expand outward, and they're shortest towards the tip and longer towards the middle. So it doesn't only stiffen the cone, but actually works as kind of like a resonance dampener because it's more surface area in the back. So while the cone is pistoning forward and backward, it prevents the back ringing from causing any issue with the cone as far as causing any sort of back ring distortion. And mounting the voice coil at about pretty much the same proportion right there, using the oversized voice coil, they call it placing it on the nodal point of the speaker, which prevents the speaker from, it basically braces the diaphragm of the woofer where a standing wave might happen and where it could cause distortion. So these keep the distortion levels down low from 300 hertz on up at about I think it's like 0.05% or 0.5%, whereas like, anything less than 1% is considered great. But they were experimenting with using two diaphragms that are actually larger, wide, than the whole entire thing is wide. So somehow the idea was, how would we put two diaphragms back to back in a way where if you tap one end, it doesn't cause the other end to be continue, kind of like clacker balls. And they did that by using a sandwiched setup where there's actually only one active drive in the middle, and it basically does work like clacker balls. The sound in the center pretty much keeps the whole entire thing so still that I could put stuff on top of it and blast this thing and it doesn't even move because it works like clacker balls. This side plays the lower end, this side plays the higher end with a tuning frequency of around 54 hertz. Same as a port tuning on this, same port tuning on this. And at 54, they would be at the exact equilibrium. But at any point, no matter what, since they also that's also where they rise, because that's where the natural resonance of this sealed cavity is. It would be at its most unstable, where it's actually the most stable, ironically, because it's able to basically, at 54, both sides are playing at completely even matched, I guess, resonance from both sides. So you can actually put a quarter on top and have it float and just stand on its edge and play throughout like an entire song and blast it as loud as you want, and it'll just stand on its edge. So I have a lot of videos of that online, and it's supposed to be impossible to do that without dual coupled force canceled drivers, but using a clacker ball type situation, you could also do that. So I don't know how practical that would be to the DIY world, but it works. If you want to check out like the video, I could send you a link, and it's pretty impressive in the sense where you could play the full range of this subwoofer, which is actually pretty wide. It goes down to like 40 and up to like 350 hertz, and it doesn't shake enough to even cause a quarter that's placed on top to roll, never mind fall over. And then there's this video I have where I just like simply, just like tap my foot, and then the quarter falls, regardless of how much the bass was causing rumble to begin with. So yeah, just kind of sharing some investigation I was doing on these because I thought the design was like really interesting. And it's really odd that you still see the designs being used and being trickled forward, but it's not quite all there. In the current iteration of these, what they call the metas, they finally added the gasket seal. So now you can play as loud as you want without there being turbulence, and it still sounds smooth, just like these do. But it also allows for the internal chamber to be as pressurized as these guys, which gives it that more of that airy sound, more of that sound that I was describing in the other video, where it sounds like you're hearing both the sound of the speaker from the front and almost as if you were inside the speaker at the same time. And the inside of the speaker had the acoustics of a really nice cathedral Sydney Opera House type thing, which is why this thing right here looks kind of like the Sydney Opera House. It doesn't have any right angles. It's all complete curved. Even the front is, rather than flat, it's crescent shaped. It's completely rounded in the back, and the front again is that phi ratio, just like this thing right here is the same phi ratio. Just like the port on the back of this thing is the same phi ratio, as far as it not being round, but this shape. And there's a flexible portion in the middle, which allows for like a broader bandwidth, more tonal sound, versus just like a I guess a port you would add to like a subwoofer, like a open, like a ported subwoofer to give it a bump. Instead, it actually allows for more of a almost like an open baffle like sound, where the port actually sounds more musical and plays this phase relationship with what's happening from the front. And then the two work in unison and create this kind of three-dimensional holography with it. And the reason why I use these more than these is especially for like things like video games, where you use sound a lot more, where you can hear things like like an enemy like firing something behind you or walking around you. These things actually make everything way more precise, and everything sounds more 3D. Even like rain sounds like it's actually literally over me and not just like in front of me. Whereas these things do sound sharper. Sometimes people complain about them being bright, so people tend to like to match them to warm subwoofers. Sorry, warm amps. But besides that, it's designed so that it's supposed to match the sound signature of the LS35As. And LS35As were ear tuned to sound as much as possible like real life as you get. In America, the difference is that what we consider real life is actually pretty much JBL. Just like how in Britain, when there used to be a term, tonoi, it's just like how like inline skates are called rollerblades. People would say, "Hey, let's listen to the tonoi to hear the metro station hours." And the tonoi would refer to the ceiling speaker playing in mono. So a tonoi would be what their generic speaker from the overhead would sound like. But it wasn't until the BBC came out and they needed a monitor that would standardize sound that they needed it to sound perfect for the human voice, and to also sound as pleasant in a way that would sound both genuine but not grating, in a way where you could listen to it all day and it wouldn't cause your ears to bleed. So a lot of that was working with the crossover, because at the crossover is the region where we tend to put it between 2K and 3K, which happens to be where the loudness region of our ears peak. So when a speaker is crossing over, the tweeter and the woofer are actually both playing at the same time. It's not like the tweeter and the woofer switch off at some point and then the woofer just kicks in. They both blend together. So there's a point between, for these two is 2.2 kilohertz, where both the tweeter and the woofer are playing at the loudest they would ever play together. And when that happens, especially in like a small room or something like that, you would end up with a situation where you're hearing the tweeter and the woofer at the same time, both blaring at you really loud, and the reflections. So both the mains would be playing the tweeter and the woofer at the same time at the crossover point, and the reflections of the wall would all sum together, causing a rise right where your ears basically would register it as a sound of nails on chalkboard if you were just to play only those frequencies. But just like, Niagara Falls, you can listen to like the whole entire range and it won't hurt your ears. But if you were to cut the whole entire sound of Niagara Falls down to just the range between 2 and 3K, it would sound horrible. But by having it so that it's able to have the full breadth of the sound, it's kind of almost like light in a way, where like if you were to have, like a really bright green, it would look, on like a black surface, it would look very bright. But if you put green on like a surface with lots of other colors, it blends in and it doesn't look too bright anymore. So yeah, with these things, they're able to play up to 55 kilohertz. So they're able to play actually higher than any modern KEF speaker. They're the last ones to be able to do that, because the first ones to be able to do that were the first ones that eliminated the hypertweeter, which was the XQ-XX series. And then the 2007 had a version 2 that followed suit. And so this inherited the tweeter from that, which is why it's able to play with such a broad bandwidth. But yeah, I just thought that was some interesting information about design and, I guess, marketing. And that's why I have both these and tend to use these more, especially for gaming and movies and music. But these also are really fun to switch to as well. Anyway, thanks.